After taking care of the paralyzed CEO for 2 years, she recovered, and the first thing she did was propose to the love of her life who had once abandoned her. The media said they were inseparable and finally became a couple. I looked up at the big screen in the square, quietly watching the live stream of the proposal, and tossed the ring in my pocket into the trash. The debt I owed her was finally repaid. People on the pedestrian street stopped, looking up at the outdoor screens broadcasting the proposal. Not just here, every available big screen in City A was showing the same proposal. The image was clear, you could even see the eyelashes. The layout screamed Annie's touch. She spent months in recovery sketching this, even handling the fireworks designs herself. Back then, she held my hand with icy fingers, asking what flowers I liked. I said hyacinths, but the entire proposal scene on the screen was surrounded by a sea of passionate roses, and the leading man wasn't me but Annie's ex-boyfriend, celebrity designer David. I looked up calmly. The proposal reached the part where Annie extended her hand for the ring box. The diamond ring in the black velvet box sparkled like a star, compared to which the one in my pocket didn't qualify as a ring. The guys next to me excitedly cheered. CO Annie. Her long hair is stunning. No wonder they used to call her the female playgirl of City A. Heard David gave up everything to care for her during her paralysis. It's a fairy tale love, truly meant to be. I silently squeezed my wrist, still marked with scars from taking care of Annie. Back then, David had broken up with Annie and gone to Milan to study. The crowd quickly held its breath as the proposal reached its peak. David lowered his head, looking at the person in front of him, and said, "I do." The ring slipped onto his ring finger, and Annie tiptoed to kiss him. In that moment, fireworks exploded over all of City A. With this display, not just City A, but probably the whole country knew. It made sense since Annie was always like that. When she liked someone, she wanted the whole world to know. The crowd buzzed with excitement. The guy next to me nodded enthusiastically, gripping my wrist, saying how well they fit together. Don't you think? I endured the pain in my wrist, smiled, yeah, they match. He noticed my pale face and reluctantly let go, wanting to apologize, but I had already turned around and left amidst the noise. On the big screen behind me, the main characters shared an emotional kiss, and the crowd screamed and cheered for their love while the sky exploded with fireworks. I suddenly stopped beside a trash can. Squatting down to collect myself, I stood back up and pulled out a dull ring from my pocket. It wasn't pretty nor fit well. Fortunately, I no longer needed to keep it. I threw the ring into the trash, feeling more at peace than ever. From now on, the debt to her family, to Annie, was all repaid. I was kicked out of the corporation. I used to have my own office, but now not even a desk. HR handed me a box. "Henry, your stuff is here. I get along well with everyone," so she whispered, "Annie personally asked you to leave, you'll get compensation, just go." She was being kind. I figured Annie's real words were more like telling me to scram, probably lounging in her chair, not caring at all. Struggling with the box, I passed what used to be my office and discovered its new occupant, David's lounge, littered with design sketches. His intimate pictures with Annie covered up where my tightly packed schedule used to be. Looking down, my fingers gripping the box went white for a second. Then I let go. Forget it. I got pushed down at the company's entrance. The box tumbled and my stuff scattered. Too many people gathered here. Someone stepped on my hand. A sharp pain. A swarm of reporters and people rushed in one direction. I endured the pain and looked up, seeing David escorting her out. He liked red, his hair styled sharply, but the woman beside him was even more stunning. Annie didn't enjoy the crowd, looking slightly annoyed, but she still protected David attentively. Reporters blocked David, thrusting microphones, firing questions one after another. David, the online trending topic for the century proposal, has been #1 for a week. As the leading man, what do you have to say? David smiled and replied, "I'm very fortunate. During her 2 years of hardship, it was always me by her side." Annie's journey was always smooth, reigning at the top, except those 2 years post-car accident when she was paralyzed, kicked while down, and tasted the world's coldness. No one had more right than David to say that. Back then, he'd flown off, leaving only me by Annie's side. This was such an obvious lie, yet Annie seemed pleased, not arguing, even encouraging. Annie lowered her eyes, looking at David with tenderness, like a wildfire finally halted by a river. Flashes popped, capturing the two gazing lovingly into each other's eyes for the tabloids. Annie suddenly turned, her eyes locking onto mine through the crowd, nearly freezing cold. I quietly met her gaze, smiling softly, feeling relieved. She subconsciously frowned. Actually, I am lucky too. For those 2 years of her life's low, I was there by Annie's side. All my debts of gratitude were settled. The taxi was taking forever. I felt light-headed and my stomach hurt, holding it as I crouched by the roadside. The hand that got stepped on was swollen and bleeding, in severe pain. David really is something special to Annie. I've known Annie for a long time. She's always been a young lady with a trail of suitors, but the only boyfriend she ever publicly acknowledged was David. A broken mirror finding wholeness again, it makes sense. I suddenly heard a car horn. Instinctively, I looked up. A black car stopped right in front of me. The window rolled down, and there was Annie with her usual nonchalant look, tapping her knuckles on the steering wheel. Stomachache again? I blinked a little. She scoffed, her eyes sarcastic and full of disdain. Serves you right. I lowered my eyes. It felt like stepping back 2 years in time with Annie's attitude towards me. She was just as awful back then. She said that for someone like me, being alive was already a blessing. I only now realized that the affection she showed later was all an act. She was afraid if I left, there'd be no one to take care of her. So I ignored her. I heard footsteps behind me. David walked around and got into the passenger seat. Annie, I'm late. Those journalists were relentless. I should have come with you to help fend them off. While fastening his seatbelt, David turned to see me. His voice caught and he turned a little pale. In a rush, he urged, Annie, let's go. We're gonna be late for the party. Annie frowned slightly, almost unintentionally. I endured the pain and looked up at Annie, guessing this would be the last time we talked. I saw your engagement livestream. The actual event looked even better than the sketches you drew. Except there were no hyacinths. Everything else was perfect. I added, congrats to you both, wishing you forever happiness. Annie stopped smiling. Her hand on the car window tightened as if she heard anything but a blessing. I looked down, missing the look she gave me. David lapsed into silence, softly saying, Annie, time's running out. Don't waste it on irrelevant people. From above, I heard a flat voice. Annie said, Henry, you'll regret it. She waited a bit, got no reply, snickered, restarted the engine, and drove off. I looked up dazed, only seeing the tail end of her black car. Kinda reminded me of how she used to speed in her sports car. Even if it's a blessing coming from me, Annie would inexplicably get mad. She's got issues, but I won't regret it. Been waiting forever, no taxi in sight. I'd almost resigned myself when my phone suddenly buzzed. A message popped up, straight to the point. Where are you? I hesitated a moment, then sent over my location. Half an hour later, I sat in a business car, awkwardly extending my hand. The woman in front of me lowered her eyes, treating my wound. Carrie looked up. Does it hurt? I stiffened nervously, shaking my head. Carrie bent down, blew on my hand, coolly, making me flinch slightly. I insisted. I said it doesn't hurt. Only then did she release my hand, muttering, couldn't hear you. Right now, I felt like a traitorous minister. As Annie's longtime sidekick, Annie always ended up in fights with Carrie. From schoolyard to business battles, they've been arch enemies. Especially those 2 years Annie was paralyzed, Carrie almost took over her empire. Though now Annie and I had no ties, it was tough to adjust. Carrie leaned back gradually. There's a dinner party tonight. I'm short a date. Lowering my head, I noticed the wound was already treated. Annie will be there, right? Carrie replied and sighed. I avoided her gaze, then eventually spoke. If you're hoping to use me to hurt Annie, you'll probably be disappointed. She doesn't care about me. My voice was soft, stating the truth calmly. Carrie fidgeted with a lighter, a flicker of flame highlighting her fingers. She said, don't be so sure. I turned, staring out at the scenery zipping past the window, letting out a small laugh. It reminded me of Annie when she was 17. She'd laughed openly and mockingly in front of all her friends. Henry? I could never like Henry. When getting my hairstyle done and suits tried, Carrie stayed present. She was picky, rejecting several high-end ones. Honestly, I didn't want to attend that party, but Carrie insisted, so what could I do? Half a month ago, leaving Annie's house meant leaving everything. Carrie's grandma took me in temporarily. So whatever Carrie wanted, I tried my best to oblige. While trying on a silver-white suit, the hem shimmering like the Milky Way, Carrie's gaze settled on me. She finally nodded, "This one it is." I glanced at the mirror beside me, falling silent in surprise. The reflection was both unfamiliar and familiar, dazzlingly handsome. The quiet boy who once stood silently in Annie's shadow, so unnoticed, suddenly stood out. I'd never seen myself like this before. Reaching out carefully, I touched the cold mirror surface. Carrie stood behind me, holding a brooch at her fingertips. Tilting slightly, she pinned it on, her breath warm and voice gentle. "Henry, not going there to spite them. Just want to make Annie see that she's not just paralyzed. She's blind too." This was my first time at such a business event, despite sticking by Annie all those years. I was never her partner. Carrie and I arrived fashionably late. Right before entering the ballroom, I looked up at Carrie. The lighting inside momentarily highlighted her profile, a bit blinding. Whispers arose around us, only then did I snap back. "Who's the guy with Carrie? They look great together. Isn't Carrie always going solo?" Nearby, someone close to Annie took a long look, then uttered an expletive. "Damn. Isn't that Annie's plain old assistant?" Just as that was said, I heard a glass shatter. I glanced towards the noise. There stood Annie, a broken wine glass at her feet. Red wine splashed onto David's pant legs. He frowned, but she was unfazed, staring at me steadily. Never had she seen me like this, left a little dazed. Seeing me now, she was stunned, unfamiliar. David raised his head, taking a moment to recognize me, appearing utterly shocked. I nodded politely, accompanying Carrie to mingle. Annie finally noticed the woman next to me. Her eyes went from surprise to icy as she strode over and tried to pull me away. Carrie was quick to react. She reached out and blocked Annie, looping her arm through mine to pull me closer behind her. Annie looked past Carrie at me. "Henry, come here." I had never taken anyone else's side over Annie's before, let alone hid behind someone else. Whenever she called my name, no matter how far away, I would always run to her. But now it was different. I didn't step back. In a calm, quiet voice, just like every other time I'd spoken to her, I said, "I've done enough over the years." The midsummer breeze blew in through the window. "Annie, we're done." Her face went pale instantly. Midsummer is a time for meetings. I was a kid supported by Carrie's family. It wasn't just me. Our county had been helped by Annie's mom since the earthquake. But my first time at Carrie's house was when I was 15. I was the top student in the county that year, and I joined the adults in bringing local specialties to thank Carrie's mother. Carrie's mother was as gentle as I imagined, chatting with the adults about plans for next year and taking countless phone calls, looking very busy. I stood to the side, glimpsing a photo on her desk. The girl in the photo looked about my age, with delicate features and an impatient look at the camera. She seemed like a princess. The butler suddenly knocked, looking a bit troubled. "Ma'am, the young miss is out riding her motorcycle again." Carrie's mom, busy, just nodded dismissively. "Go get her back." The butler looked conflicted. It seemed like a difficult task. The adults next to me nudged me forward, chuckling awkwardly. "Let Henry go with the butler. He gets on well with kids his age." Carrie's mom's gaze finally settled on me. I curled my fingers, gathered my courage, and nodded. "I can do it. Even if I couldn't, I had to." I followed the butler to where Annie was on the mountain road. She was 17 then, already poised and graceful. Riding a black and red motorcycle, she only stopped when she nearly reached me. As she took off her helmet, her sharp eyes showed, languid and lazy. She asked, "Country bumpkin, who are you?" I closed my eyes, feeling pale. I almost thought she was going to run me over. After a moment, I spoke. "I'm Henry." She seemed amused. Her second sentence. "Carrie's mom wants me to take you back." Her face turned cold. Annie wasn't the obedient type, but I was stubborn too. If she wouldn't go, I wouldn't leave either. I waited by the road. She'd pass once and find me still there. After the second pass, I was still there. By the third lap, maybe embarrassed, she stopped and reluctantly took me back with her. I followed behind her, feeling she was so aloof. The midsummer evening breeze blew in. I remembered her name, Annie. Carrie's mom wanted a peer around Annie to watch over her, so I stayed, becoming Annie's little sidekick, helping to make sure she didn't get into too much trouble. Annie was a rebellious teen and especially disliked me, seeing me as her mom's spy. She always picked on me, but I'd wipe my tears and keep following her. She gave up on caring. As Annie put it, I was annoying as hell. Everyone knew that though Annie had countless flings, she always had this plain kid by her side, barely noticeable, who would only step in to stop her from going too far. I worked hard at school, tried to fulfill Carrie's mom's requirements, and stuck by Annie's side. 7 or 8 years passed like this, all while keeping a secret to myself. The year I finished high school, standing under the jacaranda tree, Annie leaned against the yard's fence. Her words were casual, yet felt like they throttled my heart and exposed my secret. She asked, "You like me?" I froze, unable to move for a long time. Jacaranda petals fell on me, and it took ages before I heard my own hoarse voice. "Yes, I like you." Annie chuckled and walked away. That night, I went to find Annie. As I pushed open the room's door, I heard Annie laughing indulgently, sprawled on the sofa. Her voice wasn't loud, but it felt deafening, not just to my ears, but my whole being hurt. "Who'd like Henry? I like David's type." That was the first time I heard David's name. I was 2 years younger than Annie, skipped a grade in high school to catch up to her at university. But at that moment, I realized there are things you just can't catch up to, no matter how hard you try. The 15-year-old Henry who first met Annie would have never guessed that, years later, we'd still be on bad terms, to the point of causing a scene at someone else's party. Especially now, at Annie's first party after her recovery. She and Carrie already had a rocky relationship, and everyone was keeping an eye on them since they arrived. As we faced off, people were watching, some openly, some secretly. I tugged at Carrie's sleeve, whispering, "Let's go." Annie's eyelids fluttered, and I avoided her gaze. For the first time in years, she heard me say, "Let's go," to someone else while she was there. We walked quite a distance before I glanced back. Annie was still standing there, head down. It reminded me of when she woke up fragile and cold from the car accident 2 years ago. Carrie's mom had already passed by then. David wanted to reach out to her but was frozen by one look from her. I smiled a bit. Carrie raised an eyebrow. "What's so funny?" I murmured, just realizing that not everyone can do it. Not everyone can handle Annie's mood swings and princess antics. Not everyone, after seeing her other side, would still choose to stick around. Especially during the time when she was paralyzed. Annie, who was always the golden child, just couldn't accept that she'd become disabled. She stopped smiling, lost all her spirit. Plus, the fact that the only family she had left, Carrie's mom, also died in that car crash didn't help. Back then, Annie had no will to live and attempted suicide multiple times. I smashed a glass, picked up a shard, and slashed it across my wrist. "If you want to die, that's fine. I'll go with you." Annie had never seen me this intense. Her dark eyes stared at me for a long time, almost through gritted teeth. She promised, "Henry, I'll get better." After that, she started cooperating with the doctors. 2 years later, she finally stood up. Then, she ditched her wheelchair. After the banquet, I headed back to Carrie's place with her. I've been staying with Carrie's grandma, who has been kind enough to take me in. I'm actively preparing my resume, and once I get a job, I'll move out. Honestly, Carrie and I aren't that close. The only time we'd interact was when Annie got into fights with her. I'd have to apologize to Carrie on Annie's behalf. Carrie's grandma always welcomed me warmly, waving her fan. She'd say, "Oh, it's no big deal. Kids fight. Have a seat, young man." I'd end up sitting the whole afternoon, awkwardly watching as Carrie's grandma applied herbal ointment on her. The afternoon sun streamed through, filling the room with light, and made my conscience feel guilty. Who would have thought, now in hard times, it's Carrie's family that's helping me out. Carrie and I aren't really talkers, so the car ride was quiet. I sat there like a schoolboy, all stiff, eyes straight ahead. When I glanced up, I caught a glimpse of Carrie through the rearview mirror. She seemed pretty tired. Her long eyelashes stood out as her eyes were closed. Neons flickered across her face. Carrie opened her eyes, noticed me looking at her reflection. I quickly looked away, feeling a tad awkward, but not overly so. Carrie suddenly laughed and asked, "Henry, do you remember what I thought when I first saw you?" How could I forget? She had said it right in front of Annie. Nodding, I replied, "You asked if I was blind or why else I'd follow Annie around." Annie was so mad then, they fought again. Carrie shook her head, closing her eyes. Outside, the city was bustling. Inside the car, it was quiet for so long, I thought she'd fallen asleep. Then I heard her say softly, I thought, "Why is he so well behaved?" It's been a while since I visited Annie's mom. I took a bunch of white flowers to the cemetery to see her. Shortly after Annie took over the company, a runaway truck crashed into their car. One died, one got hurt. She was a kind woman. If it weren't for her, I wouldn't know where I'd be. I cleared the weeds near her grave and chatted with her slowly. Annie's mom, the charity work you cared about is still going strong, growing bigger. The foundation gets so many thank you letters that a room can't hold them all. I glanced at the flower, a droplet of dew almost falling. Annie's healed, no different from before. The company's back on track. She recently got engaged, and the media's made a big deal out of it, calling it a once-in-a-lifetime ceremony. The guy's David, someone Annie brought home. They're doing great. Everything's moving in a good direction. Except for me. All these years, I'm still stuck in the same place with no direction. The smiling woman in the photo on the gravestone seemed to listen. I touched the photo. "I've resigned. Would you blame me?" Of course, there was no answer. The cemetery was silent. Death doesn't make a sound. Except for those early days, honestly, I haven't been happy here. Sometimes I think if I hadn't placed first in that exam back then, things might be different. I zoned out, staring at the headstone, before packing up to leave. Standing up, I noticed someone standing not too far off. Not sure how long they'd been there. I lowered my gaze. There was only one exit, so I had to walk towards Annie. She was probably visiting Carrie's mom too, coincidentally. As I brushed past her, Annie spoke. "Being sad in front of my mom, but she didn't get to finish." I turned my head, looking at her. The sadness in my eyes flickered. Annie swallowed her words. "Our relationship isn't that bad. This kind of attitude only happened twice. Once when I secretly sent resumes out of frustration working as Annie's assistant. She found out and was furious. Another was recently, after she got an email and kicked me out of Carrie's. One was before the accident, one after, 2 years apart. But I'm not as upset as I used to be." I quietly looked at her, asking on behalf of my past self. "Annie, just because I never showed it, did you really think I wouldn't be sad? Did you think that no matter what you did, I'd always just follow you like when I was 15? Annie pressed her lips, her eyes dark. Her hand curled a few times by her side, then tightened. With a mocking smile, she said, "Henry, you still don't get it. You're the reason my mom died. So what are you pretending?" Even after returning, my head was still spinning. Annie, standing tall, threw one last line at me. "That accident wasn't just an accident. Guess who sold out Annie's family?" I received an email, my hands shaking as I opened it. Inside was info Annie's people collected. Signs showed that crash was no accident. Annie's mom and she were on their way to sign a big contract, and those plans were absolutely private, except to me. I'm the only one who knows. I'm Annie's assistant and grew up at her place. They always trusted me. Inside is a photo showing me meeting with someone from a rival group. The timing is sensitive, right before everything went down. But that picture is totally fake. I don't even know that person. To Annie, though, I was like the only leak. She didn't even bother asking me about it before deciding I was guilty. I let out a bitter laugh, curling up in my chair. No wonder. No wonder she had me drawn up the plans for a proposal one day and asked me to leave the next. No wonder she'd rather run back to David than have anything to do with me. I closed my email, not even defending myself, because I knew Annie wouldn't listen. If she had just dug a little deeper, she would have found out it wasn't only me who knew where she was. There was also David. I hadn't slept that well in a long time. Before Annie's accident, I was already looking for a new job behind her back. David was just too aggressive, and honestly, I was tired. He was Annie's only real boyfriend for years, totally spoiled by her, and he couldn't stand me. I had my share of trouble with her other guy friends, but it was never this bad. Can you imagine a guy in his early 20s getting humiliated in front of the whole company? David did that. It was during a week when Annie was working on contracts, and her mom's whereabouts were kept secret. Even David didn't know. He couldn't get in touch with Annie, but I knew where she was. He asked me, and I wouldn't budge, even blocking the office door. Everyone knew he was Annie's favorite, but I wasn't scared to stand up to him. So he called in the whole company to watch and slapped me across the face. He said something like, "Henry, even if you were standing naked in front of Annie, she wouldn't spare you a glance. Get out of my way. You think leeching off the Carrie family will get you out of your poor background? Following Annie around like you're not just a side piece." I hadn't done anything wrong, but standing there, it was like I was stripped bare in front of everyone. He barged into the office and saw Annie's schedule. The next day, Annie and her mother had their accident. I never suspected David, because Annie and her mom had been so good to him. Now I get it. Only those who don't feel loved are the ones carefully noting every kindness they receive, planning how to pay it back in spades. That's me. I woke up and everything had changed. The top trending topic on my feed was Annie's car crash conspiracy in a city. Everyone loves a good scandal, especially with Annie's big proposal making waves before. An insider leaked that her accident wasn't an accident at all, but a carefully planned attack by a rival group. The leak blamed her assistant, who was supposedly that boy the Carrie family supported. They even attached the Photoshop picture from my inbox. David responded, reined in a bit, grinning gently on camera. "Henry? I never liked him, but he was always with Annie. I even got mad at Annie because of him before. Never thought he'd do something like this." The interview was long, basically calling me a traitor, a typical ingrate character from a drama. Annie just stood there, looking indifferent. I read the comments online. They raised that assistant for years, and he turned out to be a snake. Poor Carrie's mom. David's been through hell, having to deal with that jealous assistant. They need to report him, make sure he doesn't get away with this. Does anyone know where he is now? What company would even hire him? I gotta say, David and Annie must have had it tough to stay together all this time. True love, right? Someone suddenly took my phone. I looked up to see Carrie staring at my pale face. "Stop reading that. Grandma said dinner's ready." I opened my mouth to explain. It wasn't me. Carrie didn't even pause. I know. It wasn't just words. She genuinely believed me. Just like everyone was saying, the interviewers I got along with well before all declined to hire me. If I didn't clear my name, I'd probably be socially dead forever, unable to find work. That's the ending Annie wanted for me, miserable, revenge served cold. Only Carrie's company dared to consider me. I'd applied everywhere, even to the Carrie group. But I turned it down, and while Carrie flipped through my resume without looking up, she asked me, "Why?" I shook my head. My reputation's terrible right now. Any company I join would just get caught in the storm. Is it bad for you? Carrie tilted her head, studying me quietly for a moment, then smiled a bit wearily. "Henry, you're pretty oblivious." Oblivious about what? I was still trying to figure it out when the police came and took me away. Carrie had reported it, and since I was part of the case or a potential suspect, of course, I had to be questioned. Before going into the interrogation room, I saw Annie and David. Their faces were a sight. David looked like a gambler going all in. I kind of got it, though. He'd cleaned up his tracks well enough over the years. Any evidence was probably long gone. The only thing between him and Annie now was me. Once I was locked up, he'd have nothing left to worry about. Not only was the world-ending proposal real, but there'd also be some world-ending wedding soon. He'd be the envy of everyone as Annie's husband. Annie's expression was a mix of emotions as she looked at me. I noticed her hands were fidgeting, trembling slightly. She glanced at me, then turned away, her eyes red. I looked away and stepped into the interrogation room. In just a matter of hours, the police dug up everything about my entire life, clean and bare. Alongside the photo, there was more evidence stacked against me, fitting together all too conveniently, like a net trying to trap me. I was temporarily held in custody. It wasn't long, just 10 days. Carrie's family car crash case had a huge impact online, and in just a few days, conspiracy theories had spread like wildfire, impossible to suppress. The higher-ups took it seriously, pooling significant police resources to ensure justice and avoid missing any clues. During those 10 days, I didn't think about anything. I hadn't rested this well in a long time, sleeping heavily for days. On the 10th day, the truth came out, and I was released without charge. This time, the wanted fugitive list didn't just include Carrie's family's criminal rivals. It also added another name, David. Justice may be slow, but it never fails. The police cleared my name. As I stepped out of the city police station, I barely had time to breathe in the fresh air before an avalanche of flashlights blinded me. Reporters who had long awaited outside spotted their chance and shoved microphones in my face, bombarding me with questions. Henry, what do you think about David being the one who betrayed the group? Henry, all these years by Annie's side, was it because you liked her? Henry, when Annie was paralyzed, the one standing by her wasn't David? Who was taking care of her? Was it you? I was almost suffocating from the pressure, but thankfully, a hand pulled me away. Carrie pushed a bouquet of flowers for good luck into my arms and carefully helped me into the car. As I got into the car, I looked back at the chaotic media frenzy, and I saw Annie, standing distantly, looking exhausted and fragile. I answered the last question from the media, saying softly, "No, it wasn't me by Annie's side during that time. I gave up on her a long time ago. So much happened in those 10 days. Online, I went from being showered with insults, with people wishing for my execution, to seeing the truth surface bit by bit. The first wave began when someone posted photos of David studying in Milan, exposing the lie he had spun. Everyone realized that when Annie's accident happened, David abandoned her to fly to Milan. He enjoyed a peaceful time while she struggled on. Their love story, which people believed in, especially the bit about sticking together during tough times, turned into a scandal of deceit. The public was disgusted. The second wave started when someone uploaded a video online showing David slapping me. The video was clear, showing how I was humiliated, holding my swollen face while standing in front of Annie's office, only to be shoved to the ground by him. David, always perceived as gentle, looked wild and even sinister in the video. His image as an outstanding professional man, active in workplace reality shows and the internet, shattered. Rumors said David didn't even dare pick up his phone during those days, surrounded by curses. More revelations surfaced, too chaotic to discern truth from falsehood, until the police announcement cleared my name, while David became a wanted man. Such an announcement was more convincing than anything. Interviewers who previously rejected me all reached out again, but I turned them down, even Carrie's family. I had no intention to go back. I received a call from my hometown. My old school's principal, a man as admirable as Carrie's mother, asked if I'd come back to teach and support the local education development. So I agreed. I visited Carrie's house one last time. This time, nothing could stop me. I hadn't taken my belongings, thinking the room would be covered in dust. But as I opened the door, it was spotless and bright, sunlight casting down on freshly arranged flowers on the table. I packed quickly and hesitated for a moment before opening the drawer. Still, I retrieved a photo from an obscure compartment, a photo from an old camera, capturing a girl, full of spirit, the evening breeze brushing her hair. She was fooling around with friends, turning back as if checking if someone was following behind. That was Annie when I was 17, a photo I took secretly. Back then, I thought no one could grasp the midsummer winds, but I could capture it in a photograph. I left that photo on the table. Whether Annie picked it up or tossed it in the trash, it was her choice. The jacaranda tree in the yard was blooming again, hanging gracefully down. I stood there appreciating it, when Annie called me softly from behind, like she was afraid to break a dream. "Henry," I turned around and smiled at her calmly. Annie's eyes were bruised, the arrogance finally wiped away completely. As the heiress in Carrie's family, I'd never seen her look so cautious, almost humble. Her eyelashes fluttered as she spoke in a hoarse voice. "When I began recovering, I started investigating the car crash case. Until I found it connected to you, then I couldn't go on. The thought of you betraying us made it hard to breathe. I'd never considered you could betray us." This thought kept growing uncontrollably. Ironically, I wished I'd died in that car crash back then. Then I couldn't control myself, and I did what I did wrong. Even the grand proposal was for your eyes. She talked a lot about her mental journey. But I just looked at her brightly and interrupted softly. "No." Annie froze. I smiled faintly with tightly pressed lips. "Actually, when you did it, you already knew you were wrong. But you thought it was okay, indifferent. Whether I was misunderstood or truly betrayed you, no matter what you did, I'd forgive you. The truth is, I always knew that if Annie hadn't been paralyzed, abandoned by those around her, she wouldn't have noticed me. Her attention would always be on boys like David. Even the ring she gave me back then, it didn't fit." She remained silent for a long time. I thought it was the shadow of fallen blossoms on the ground. But it turned out to be Annie's tears, falling. She reached out and grabbed my wrist, pleading, "I'm a fool. Can you forgive me just one last time?" The jacaranda trees cast dappled shadows, taking me back to when I was 17. Annie leaned against the railing and asked, "Henry, do you like me?" But now, after thinking it over, I gently pried her hand away. "I won't forgive you," I said. She saw the gray-brown scar on my wrist. Her eyes widened, her lips trembled, but she couldn't say a word. I spoke patiently, like comforting a child. "Annie, your life was saved in the car accident by Carrie's mother. You need to live well. The company is her legacy, and you have to protect it." I paused. "I'm leaving this place." Annie's face turned impossibly pale, all the color drained away. At that moment, she felt a hollow in her heart. Someone she always thought would be there was gone for good. The midsummer breeze, once it passes, never returns. Recently, the tides have changed in City A. What was once called the proposal of the century, featuring Annie and David, turned them into infamous figures, a bad girl and a bad guy. David's misdeeds and Annie's complicity left the company's stocks plummeting. For some reason, Annie drove into a crash, breaking her leg, and now she's wheelchair-bound. On the bus back to the county, I got a message from Annie. She said, "I'll repay all that I owe you." I casually blocked her. I turned my head to look at the passing scenery, swaying just like when I first arrived. Reflected in the window was the person beside me, Carrie. She seems to like sleeping. She's leaning back with her eyes closed now. Even though she's a CEO, Carrie insisted on donating school supplies and taking the bus with me to oversee the delivery. I couldn't stop her, so I let her come along. As the bus swayed, Carrie's head rested on my shoulder, but she still didn't wake up. I smiled a bit, pressing my lips together. Looking forward, the scenery changed along the way, but I was certain I was heading into countless midsummers of my own.